Mike, let me read you this part. So here's what's normal. The Times actually takes us through this in the story. What's normal, actually, the Times reports out what the Justice Department manual says is normal. Quote, according to the Justice Department manual, settlements of claims against the department for more than $4 million, this is $230 million, quote, must be approved by the Deputy Attorney General or Associate Attorney General, meaning the person who oversees the agency's civil division. Quote, the current Deputy Attorney General, Todd Blanche, served as Trump's lead criminal defense lawyer and said at his confirmation hearing in February that his attorney-client privilege with the president continues. The chief of the department's civil division, Stanley Woodward Jr., represented Trump's co-defendant, Walt Nauta, in the classified documents case. Mr. Woodward has also represented a number of other Trump aides, including Mr. Patel, in investigations related to Trump and the Capitol riot on January 6, 2021. Just sort of working our way backward to the stunning event of Donald Trump seeming to be aware of how, let me actually quote someone in this article, outlandish is what one of your ethics experts says to the New York Times. This all is. Does any one of the three of us doubt, as I think you've already said, Mike, that this will be one more $230 million of taxpayer money that Donald Trump will pocket?
Okay, so this is absolutely massive, and you need to hear this right now. Federal courts have just frozen every single asset Donald Trump owns, and I mean everything, triggering complete panic on Wall Street and sending Trump's financial empire into a total meltdown. We're talking real estate, business accounts, personal finances, licensing deals, all of it frozen nationwide. And while that's happening, the Department of Justice is facing its own internal collapse with legal missteps and controversial tactics that have Capitol Hill in absolute chaos. This is the biggest financial blow Trump has ever faced, and it's happening in real time. So what exactly went down? On November 16th, 2025, a federal court issued an emergency order freezing everything Trump owns across the United States. The court found that Trump had systematically lied about property values to banks and insurers for years. We're talking massive fraud on a scale that's hard to even comprehend. And because Trump failed to post the required multi-million-dollar bond to delay the judgment, the court pulled the trigger and froze everything. Just like that, Trump's entire financial empire is locked down and he can't touch any of it. But before we go any further, real quick, let's be honest. You can't really trust mainstream media anymore. That's why we built Pump Politics, to bring you real stories, real context, and no corporate spin. If you want to stay ahead of the headlines, join our free newsletter. We'll send the news straight to your inbox every day. Just click the link in the description to join. And if you just want to support what we're doing, join us, be part of the community that actually cares about the truth. All right, let's get back to the video.
Look, in this country, we're all taught from a very young age about the three branches, about checks and balances and the sort of special sauce nature of them that makes our democracy the democracy that is, and that really sets it apart. And the uniqueness of the Trump second term is the ability to see a true testing of that, something we've all been taught, and seeing, okay, how do checks and balances in the three branches hold up? And this is a situation that, you know, at least to me, the non-lawyer, shows one of those tests. And there is no sort of natural remedy for it. You have a Congress that is compliant with Trump. You can't see them standing up for anything. It's a Congress run by folks that don't want to spend the government's money or believe in small government. But they would never say anything about this $200 million. Andrew lays out a situation in which taxpayers could try and bring a lawsuit to try to stop something like that. And sure, maybe something like that works. But if you think about the way that checks and balances are supposed to work, this seems to pierce right through it, because he controls the presidency, he controls the Justice Department, and he's found a way through that to do what in many ways, dating back to his time in New York in the 70s and 80s, is essentially adjudicate his own lawsuits. And I don't know, obviously this is not something that the founders thought through, but it sure shows a stress on the checks and balance system that,
The reaction on Wall Street was immediate and brutal. Banks and financial institutions that had any exposure to Trump or the Trump organization started dumping their holdings like they were radioactive. Credit lines got slashed. Accounts got frozen. Asset sales happened so fast, it made your head spin. We saw a sharp market dip in Trump-linked holdings as investors scrambled to get out before they got caught in the blast radius. This isn't just embarrassing for Trump, this is existentially threatening to his entire business empire and his political brand, which has always been built on the image of him as this brilliant, successful billionaire businessman. Well, that image just took a massive hit because now the courts are saying he built that empire on lies and fraud. Prosecutors are now authorized to seize Trump's properties to satisfy the fraud judgment. We're talking about Trump Tower, Mar-a-Lago, golf courses, business accounts, everything. The New York Attorney General, Letitia James, is leading the enforcement, and she's been crystal clear about her intentions. She said no one is above the law, not even a former president, and she means it. She's going after Trump's crown jewels, the properties that define his brand and his identity. Imagine Trump without Trump Tower. Imagine him without Mar-a-Lago. That's what we're looking at here, the complete dismantling of the Trump empire. Here's what makes this even more insane. This asset freeze stems directly from Trump's failure to post hundreds of millions in bond. When you lose a massive civil judgment like Trump did in the New York fraud case, you can delay enforcement by posting a bond, basically putting up collateral that guarantees you'll pay if you lose your appeal. But Trump either couldn't or wouldn't post that bond. Maybe he doesn't have the liquid assets. Maybe no bonding company would touch him. Or maybe he just thought he could bluff his way through it, like he's done so many times before. Whatever the reason, it didn't work. The court said, okay, you won't post bond, then we're freezing everything until you pay up. And now Trump's facing the consequences of that decision. The scale of this is hard to overstate. We're not talking about one property or one account. We're talking about a nationwide freeze of everything Trump owns. Real estate holdings across multiple states. Business accounts for dozens of Trump Organization entities. Personal bank accounts. Investment portfolios. Licensing deals that generate revenue. All of it frozen. Trump can't sell anything. He can't transfer money. He can't use his assets as collateral for loans. He's effectively been cut off from his own wealth. And that's got to be driving him absolutely insane. Meanwhile, the Department of Justice is dealing with its own crisis. DOJ investigators are facing heavy criticism for what's being called procedural missteps and controversial tactics. We're talking about aggressive asset seizures, litigation errors, and investigation methods that have sparked a Capitol Hill uproar. The Washington Post and other outlets are reporting that these DOJ problems are fracturing the credibility of Biden-era law enforcement. So at the exact moment when Trump's getting hit with this massive financial judgment, the agency that would normally be pursuing criminal charges is in chaos. You can't make this stuff up. The timing is wild, and it raises all kinds of questions about whether the DOJ's problems will give Trump some breathing room or whether the civil enforcement by state attorneys general will be enough to bring him down regardless. The economic fallout is already being felt beyond just Trump's personal finances. Market confidence is getting spooked. Wall Street's nervous about what this means for political stability and business regulations. Big donors who've supported Republican candidates are reportedly reconsidering their positions because nobody wants to be associated with someone whose entire financial empire is being seized by the government. This has direct implications for the 2026 midterms and Republican fundraising across the board. So here's where we are. Trump's assets are frozen nationwide. Wall Street is in panic mode. The DOJ is collapsing under its own weight. And Capitol Hill is in chaos, trying to figure out what this all means. This is the most aggressive financial action ever taken against a former president, and is threatening everything Trump has built over the last 50 years. We need to break down exactly how we got here and what happens next, because this story is just getting started. Alright, so let's dig into the details of how Trump's financial empire got to this point and why this asset freeze is such a catastrophic blow. The roots of this crisis go back to the New York civil fraud case that's been grinding through the courts for the past couple years. New York Attorney General Letitia James filed a lawsuit alleging that Trump and the Trump Organization systematically inflated the value of their assets when dealing with banks and insurers. We're not talking about minor discrepancies here. We're talking about claiming properties were worth hundreds of millions more than they actually were. The fraud was systematic, it was intentional, and it went on for years. Trump would tell banks his properties were worth huge amounts when he wanted loans, then turn around and tell tax authorities the same properties were worth much less when it was time to pay taxes. That's textbook fraud, and the courts found exactly that. The judgment against Trump in the civil fraud case was massive. We're talking hundreds of millions of dollars in penalties and disgorgement of profits. Trump immediately said he would appeal, which is his right. But here's the thing about appeals. They don't automatically stop enforcement of the judgment. If you want to delay enforcement while your appeal is pending, you need to post a bond. The bond serves as a guarantee that if you lose the appeal, the money will be there to pay the judgment. For a judgment this size, Trump would have needed to post a bond of several $100 million. That's where everything fell apart for him. Trump apparently couldn't come up with the bond money. Now, on the surface, that seems weird because Trump's always claimed to be a billionaire. If you're worth billions, posting a few $100 million in bond shouldn't be that hard, right? But the reality is that most of Trump's wealth is tied up in real estate. It's not liquid. He can't just write a check for $400 million because he doesn't have that much cash sitting around. He'd need to either sell properties, which takes time, or get a bonding company to front the money for him. The problem is that bonding companies look at your financial situation and assess the risk before they'll issue a bond, and apparently, no major bonding company was willing to take on the risk of backing Trump for this amount. That tells you something about how bad his financial situation really is. If professional risk assessors who look at finances all day won't touch you, you're in serious trouble. So Trump found himself in a bind. He couldn't post the bond through normal channels, he couldn't come up with the cash, and he couldn't sell properties fast enough to raise the money before the deadline. The court said, okay, time's up, and issued the emergency order, freezing all his assets. This freeze is comprehensive and devastating. Let's talk about what it actually means in practical terms. Every piece of real estate Trump owns is now frozen. He can't sell it, he can't refinance it, he can't use it as collateral. Trump Tower, the crown jewel of his empire and his home for decades, frozen. Mar-a-Lago, his resort and his primary residence, frozen. Golf courses that generate revenue, frozen. Commercial properties that collect rent, the rent money goes into frozen accounts that Trump can't access. Business accounts for the Trump Organization and all its subsidiary companies, frozen. Trump can't pay bills, can't pay employees, can't conduct normal business operations without going through a court-appointed monitor who has to approve every transaction. Personal bank accounts, frozen. Trump can't access his own money for personal expenses. Investment accounts, frozen. Licensing deals where Trump gets paid to put his name on buildings or products, those royalty payments are going into frozen accounts. The freeze even extends to any money Trump might make in the future from these sources. If someone wants to rent space in a Trump building, that money gets frozen. If someone stays at a Trump hotel, that revenue gets frozen. Trump's entire income stream has been shut off, and he's living off whatever cash he had on hand before the freeze took effect. Now Trump's not going to be homeless or starving. He's still got access to some money for basic living expenses and legal fees. Courts don't freeze everything to the point where someone can't survive, but his lifestyle is about to change dramatically. No more flying around on private jets owned by his companies. No more lavish expenses paid by the Trump Organization. No more using company assets as his personal piggy bank. He's going to have to live like a regular rich person instead of a billionaire. And for someone whose identity is so wrapped up in displays of wealth, that's got to be psychologically devastating. The Wall Street reaction tells you how serious this is. When major banks and financial institutions start cutting ties with someone as high profile as Trump, it's because their risk management departments are screaming red alert. Nobody wants to be the bank that was still doing business with Trump when his empire collapsed and they ended up holding worthless collateral or getting sued for enabling fraud. So institutions are reviewing every loan, every line of credit, every business relationship they have with anything Trump related, and they're cutting those ties as fast as they legally can. This creates a cascade effect. When one bank pulls out, others follow because nobody wants to be left holding the bag. Asset prices for Trump-related holdings start falling because there's suddenly a flood of sellers and no buyers. Credit ratings get downgraded. Insurance becomes harder to get or more expensive. The whole financial ecosystem around Trump starts to collapse like a house of cards. And here's the really brutal part. Once this process starts, it's really hard to stop. Even if Trump somehow wins his appeal and the judgment gets reduced or overturned, the damage to his business empire may be irreversible. Companies that cut ties with him aren't going to rush back. Banks that pulled his credit lines aren't going to restore them immediately. The Trump brand, which was already damaged by his various legal problems and political controversies, takes another massive hit. Who wants to stay at a Trump hotel or buy a Trump condo when the properties might get seized by the government? Let's talk about the DOJ angle, because that adds another layer of chaos to this whole situation. The Department of Justice has historically been very careful about taking action against presidents or former presidents. There's a tradition of institutional restraint because nobody wants to look like they're weaponizing law enforcement for political purposes. But that restraint has broken down over the past few years. You've got special counsels investigating Trump. You've got DOJ lawyers pursuing criminal cases. And now you've got reports of procedural missteps and controversial tactics that are undermining the DOJ's credibility. According to reports from the Washington Post and other outlets, DOJ investigators have made serious errors in how they've handled certain investigations. We're talking about aggressive asset seizures that might not hold up in court, litigation strategies that backfired, investigation methods that raise questions about whether proper procedures were followed. And all of this is creating a Capitol Hill firestorm, with Republicans demanding investigations and Democrats trying to defend the DOJ's actions. The timing of this DOJ crisis is significant because it's happening right when Trump is facing his biggest financial and legal threats. If the DOJ were firing on all cylinders and executing flawlessly, Trump would be in even worse shape than he already is. But with the DOJ stumbling and facing credibility questions, Trump has an opening to claim that all of these actions against him are politically motivated and procedurally flawed. His supporters eat that narrative up, and even some moderates start to wonder if there's some truth to it when they hear about DOJ missteps. The Capitol chaos, referenced in the headlines, is real. Congressional committees are holding hearings. Members are demanding answers about DOJ tactics. There are calls for investigations into whether the DOJ has overstepped its authority or violated Trump's rights. And all of this is playing out in the media 24/7, creating a circus atmosphere that makes it hard for anyone to focus on the actual underlying facts of Trump's fraud case. That's probably not accidental. Trump's strategy has always been to create so much noise and confusion that people lose track of what's actually happening. If he can turn this into a story about DOJ overreach and political persecution instead of a story about his systematic fraud, he might be able to survive politically, even if he loses financially. The economic implications of Trump's asset freeze go beyond just his personal finances. There are thousands of people who work for Trump Organization companies. What happens to their jobs when the company can't operate normally? There are contractors and suppliers who do business with Trump properties. What happens to them when payments stop coming? There are investors who bought Trump-branded properties or lent money to Trump ventures. What happens to their investments? The ripple effects of taking down a business empire this size affect a lot of people who had nothing to do with Trump's fraud. That's unfortunate, but it's also inevitable. When you build a business on fraud, eventually it collapses and innocent people get hurt. The solution is not to let fraudsters keep operating, because shutting them down would be disruptive. The solution is to hold them accountable and try to minimize the collateral damage as much as possible. Okay, so let's break down what actually matters going forward and what this means for Trump's political future, because there's a lot happening, but we need to focus on the key points that will determine what comes next. Point 1, the asset freeze is not just a temporary setback for Trump, it's a potentially permanent destruction of his business empire. Even if he eventually wins some relief on appeal, the damage done during this freeze period could be irreversible. Businesses that can't operate normally for months or years don't just snap back to health when the freeze lifts. Employees leave, customers go elsewhere, contracts get canceled, reputation gets destroyed. Trump's brand has always been his most valuable asset, and watching his properties get seized by the government is about the worst possible thing for that brand. Point 2, Trump's inability to post bond reveals that his financial situation is much worse than he's let on. If you're really a billionaire with assets worth billions, you should be able to post a few $100 million in bond. The fact that Trump couldn't do that suggests his net worth is either much lower than he claims, or his assets are so encumbered with debt that he can't access their value. Either way, it exposes the lie at the heart of Trump's public persona. Point 3, the DOJ's problems create political cover for Trump, but don't actually help him in the civil case. The asset freeze is being enforced by state courts based on a civil judgment, not by the DOJ. So even if the DOJ completely collapses and stops pursuing Trump criminally, the state attorneys general can still dismantle his financial empire through civil enforcement. Trump needs to understand that having multiple enemies on multiple fronts is worse than having one powerful enemy, because he can't defend everywhere at once. Now let's talk about the specific properties that are at risk of seizure. Trump Tower is probably the most iconic. It's been Trump's home and business headquarters for decades. It's where he filmed The Apprentice. It's the building that made him a household name in the 1980s. Losing Trump Tower would be like Superman losing the S on his chest. It's that central to his identity. And prosecutors are absolutely going to target it because they know how much it means to him. The symbolism of Trump Tower being seized and sold to satisfy a fraud judgment would be devastating for Trump's ego and his political brand. His supporters might still stick with him, but the image of the great deal maker losing his signature building because he couldn't pay his debts is not the look Trump wants. Mar-a-Lago is almost as significant. Trump's made it his primary residence and his winter White House. It's where he meets with political allies, hosts fundraisers, and conducts business. It's also a private club that generates significant revenue. Seizing Mar-a-Lago would not only cost Trump a valuable asset, but would also disrupt his political operations and social network. Where does Trump go if he loses Mar-a-Lago? Does he buy another property? With what money? Does he rent? Can you imagine Donald Trump, who spent his whole life as a real estate mogul, having to rent a place to live because all his properties got seized? The humiliation would be unbearable for someone with his ego. The golf courses are interesting because they're both assets and liabilities. Some of Trump's golf courses make money, but others have been consistent money losers that he's kept afloat through subsidies from his other businesses. Seizing and selling these properties might actually be difficult because who wants to buy a Trump-branded golf course in the current environment? The properties might not sell for anywhere near what Trump claims they're worth, which would further expose how inflated his valuations were. But from a prosecutor's perspective, they're low-hanging fruit, easy to identify, easy to appraise, easy to seize. The business accounts and cash holdings are what prosecutors really want because those are liquid and can be used immediately to satisfy the judgment. Real estate takes time to sell and might not fetch the expected price, but cash is cash. If prosecutors can identify and seize Trump's business accounts, they can start satisfying the judgment right away. That's why the freeze is so comprehensive. They're trying to prevent Trump from moving money around or hiding assets before they can be seized. Trump's probably kicking himself for not doing more to protect his assets before this judgment came down. He could have transferred property to family members or put things in trust or moved money offshore. But he either didn't think he would actually lose or he didn't think the enforcement would be this aggressive. Either way, he's now paying the price for his lack of preparation. Let's talk about the political implications because Trump's not just a businessman, he's a former president who's still heavily involved in politics. How does this asset freeze affect his political standing? Well, it's complicated. On one hand, Trump's core supporters are going to see this as proof that the system is out to get him. They'll rally around him and donate money to help him fight back. Trump's always been most effective politically when he can position himself as a victim of persecution by elites. The asset freeze plays right into that narrative. On the other hand, moderate voters and independents who were maybe willing to give Trump another chance are going to look at this and think, wait, the courts found that he committed massive fraud and now his assets are being seized. Maybe all those things people said about him being a con man were true. That's going to cost Trump support in the middle, and elections are won in the middle. Trump's also going to have a harder time fundraising for political campaigns when his own financial empire is collapsing. Donors want to back winners, not losers. And someone who's losing their business empire to government seizure looks like a loser. Plus, any money Trump raises for political purposes might be tempting to use for his personal legal and financial problems, which creates all kinds of legal and ethical issues. The 2026 midterms are going to be heavily influenced by this. Democrats are going to run on accountability and rule of law. They'll point to Trump's asset freeze as evidence that nobody is above the law and that crime eventually catches up with you. Republicans are going to have to decide whether to defend Trump or distance themselves from him. Some will stick with him no matter what. Others will quietly try to change the subject and focus on local issues. But Trump's going to make it really hard for Republicans to ignore this story because he's going to be screaming about it every day on social media and at rallies. The DOJ's problems complicate the political picture because Republicans can point to DOJ missteps and argue that the entire justice system has been weaponized against conservatives. There's some truth to that concern. Law enforcement should not be used for political purposes, and when prosecutors make procedural errors or use aggressive tactics that wouldn't be used against other defendants, it raises questions about fairness. But the solution is not to let Trump off the hook for actual crimes and fraud. The solution is to ensure that investigations and prosecutions are done properly with appropriate safeguards and oversight. The problem is that in the current polarized environment, it's really hard to have that nuanced conversation. You're either pro-Trump or anti-Trump, and any middle ground gets attacked by both sides. The broader question is what this means for presidential accountability going forward. Trump's the first former president to face this level of financial and legal scrutiny. Some people think that's appropriate. Presidents shouldn't be above the law just because they held high office. Others worry that it sets a precedent where future presidents will face politically motivated investigations and prosecutions as soon as they leave office. Both concerns are valid, and we need to figure out how to balance accountability with the risk of weaponized law enforcement. What happens next in practical terms? Well, the asset freeze stays in place until Trump either pays the judgment, posts the bond, or wins his appeal. The appeal process could take months or even years. During that time, Trump's assets remain frozen, and prosecutors can start the seizure process for specific properties. Trump's going to fight every single seizure in court, which means more litigation, more legal fees, and more time. Eventually, some properties will probably be seized and sold. The money from those sales will go towards satisfying the judgment. If the sale proceeds aren't enough to cover the full judgment, prosecutors will keep seizing assets until it's paid off. Trump might end up losing a significant portion of his empire before this is all over. The Wall Street panic is probably temporary in the sense that markets will stabilize once the initial shock wears off, but the damage to Trump-related assets is likely permanent. Properties that lose the Trump name won't suddenly become more valuable. Banks that cut ties with Trump won't rush to reestablish those relationships. The Trump brand has been permanently devalued by this episode. The bottom line is this: Donald Trump is facing the most aggressive financial action ever taken against a former president. His assets are frozen nationwide, Wall Street is dumping Trump-related holdings, and prosecutors are preparing to seize his most valuable properties. The DOJ's simultaneous collapse creates political chaos, but doesn't actually help Trump in the civil case that's destroying his empire. This is a defining moment that threatens everything Trump has built over the past 50 years, and it's happening right as we head into an election year where his political influence will determine the fate of the Republican Party. Trump's going to fight with everything he has, but he's running out of weapons and running out of time. The empire is crumbling, and it's not clear that anything can stop it at this point. Stay tuned, because we're watching the potential end of the Trump business empire in real time, and the political fallout is going to be massive.